So there is a suicide in the literature that we're going to read. Um, and suicide being what it is, in our culture today is something that is tossed around lightly in some cases. Also, it comes with a lot of sort of a trigger effect in others. And it's something that I don't want to read through lightly. Um, it depends on the book that we're reading, but suicide is not an uncommon theme in literary texts because what literature tends to do is it tends to talk about things that matter. And life versus death matters. It's not something we can just kind of sweep under the rug. If we're not watching a sitcom, like I don't even know, don't watch TV, but like um sitcoms of the past at least preserve kind of themes that are jovial day to day. It tends to keep people from thinking about the fact that our time on earth really is limited and finite and that everyone does die and not a person has escaped that fate yet. Um, Biblically speaking, there's an argument for Elisha and Jesus, and that's all, I think. I think there was one other person brought up to heaven. But for the rest of us, we will die. And it tends to be a topic that is avoided, or it is sort of lauded or praised or sort of like revered, like, oh, this person was so noble that he or she decided that they were a burden to society and a burden to others, and so they decided to relieve the society of their presence. And that's where the physician assisted suicide comes in, euthanasia, that sort of thing. And so, what I wanted to do is just how do we appropriately read about it? How do we appropriately talk about it? And if you are uncomfortable reading it, what do we do? And so, I have some articles that I think are helpful that I wanted to just go through because there are people that specifically study that suicide in literature and how to teach it. I am not such an expert. So, we will just kind of glean from what the experts have to say on that topic as I kind of walk you through it. This article is called The Fatal Persuasion of Suicide in Literature, and you'll recognize some of the background that we're going to be talking about as it talks about different books, specifically Shakespeare and others that are going to come up. So it begins that some great works of literature contribute to a desperate shadow falling over the lives of emotionally vulnerable readers. It is true, some readers are emotionally vulnerable. In other words, I am not naive to think that some of you have not considered or know someone closely who has considered suicide. Life is tenuous, it is difficult, it is hard, and our emotions play very strongly upon kind of that promise that all of this could end, all of this could be over right now. And we're going to look at that more when we read Hamlet, or if we've already read Hamlet, you can kind of think about how Hamlet talks about it, that there's sort of this fear of the unknown other world that prevents some people. But ultimately, a lot of readers are emotionally vulnerable. And that doesn't mean that students shouldn't read suicidal themes in literature, but how to do it. So Geoffrey Berman, in a book called Surviving Literary Suicide, explores the relationship between literature and life, and he asserts that teachers need to be more aware of the emotional effects that literary suicide can have on students. He also points out that teachers and critics have tended to ignore the tragedy of suicide in many fictional works, and some even go to the extreme of romanticizing it. I'm not doing that here. I don't obviously think any of us should do that here. And so, for instance, there's one literary work, Kate Chopin's The Awakening. It is seen as an act of female empowerment. She can't escape the male oppression and the patriarchy, and so she drowns herself. And a lot of critics will glorify that suicide in the same way that the novel does. And basically, what they do is they present it as sort of liberating and sensuous and something that is highly respectable. But this author writes, you don't see its aftermath. You don't see the dead body. You don't see its impact upon children and spouses and loved ones. We give the wrong signal to people when we romanticize an act with such devastating interpersonal consequences. In a time of Littleton massacre and other examples of young people taking desperate measures to indicate their torment, are we being responsible by ignoring the reality of such decisions in literature? In this instance of Edna, or in this book by Kate Chopin, is her triumph over the patriarchal society worth anything when she renounces life? So, yes, okay, fine, you are triumphing over patriarchy, but you're dead. Like, that is not a heroic act. In Surviving Literary Suicide, he deals with suicide's portrayal in the works of 4 authors who later took their own lives. So Virginia Woolf, Ernest Hemingway, Sylvia Plath, and Anne Sexton. 2 who didn't, Kate Chopin and William Styron. He points out how writing about suicide influenced the writer's emotional states, and even more how such literature has the power of persuasion among young readers. He calls this the Werther effect. And so Goethe's novel, The Sorrow of Young Werther, caused scores of readers in the 18th century to commit suicide in the same manner as its protagonist. Berman definitely believes that today, in a society where 27% of students report of thinking seriously about suicide, 27%, the writings of such talents as these that we're going to read can actually have a profoundly harmful influence if it's not addressed responsibly. The moving student diary selections included in his book only reinforce this belief. Kay Redfield Jamison, she's an author of The Unquiet Mind, praised this book, Surviving Literary Suicide, in the most recent edition of a magazine. And she wrote, most powerful for me were the strength, insight, and humanity of the student responses to what they read. Berman, whose sensitivity to lives at emotional risk began 31 years ago when his best friend, a young English professor, committed suicide, and he remains adamantly against censorship. I'm not for suicide correctness, he said. I do think teachers need to be aware of the signs of suicidal tendencies in their students, and particularly think that teachers of literature need to confront the topic when it appears in literature and be honest with their students about its implications. So, I read things like that, and I want to be responsible in kind of our classroom conversation. And obviously, we don't have the benefit of being together. I don't see your faces. I don't get to see your emotional responses as you're going to be reading these passages. But what I want to be clear on is that your life, all of our lives, are infinitely significant. They matter not only like in the context of us and our material world. Obviously, our souls matter to God who created them. But I think that an issue like this, it points to grief in a person's soul about his or her own existence. That there are questions underlying an act of suicide, such as, why does this matter? Why do I matter? Why am I significant? And there are so many answers to those questions that scream out above that sense of, I can just make all these questions go away. And so my take on this is we have a character who's suffering, and rather than pushing into the questions of existence, which make life infinitely meaningful, the character just decides it has no meaning. And in killing herself or himself, it doesn't. And so rather than pushing into purpose and pushing into meaning or turning to others to ask those big questions, they opt out. In the novel that you're about to read, the character fails to take responsibility for the pain of a broken identity. And broken identities come through scores of ways. It comes through abuse. It comes through like spiritual death inside. A person is not spiritually alive and they have no hope. it comes through rejection of others. It comes through um, kind of growth. Like as you go through life and you experience change or challenge or something different, it raises questions in you that you may not have answered or asked before, and you don't have answers. All of these things can cause inner turmoil that lead to a person choosing to ignore those questions that seem like they don't have concrete answers. And I believe that's why literary authors put them in. Literary authors put these in not to flagrantly just say like, oh, look at this suicide. Let's see how gruesome and brutal we can make it, or um let's attack your emotional vulnerability as a reader, but they do it so that you as a reader can say like, if I don't ask my questions, I end up dead. And there's this whole aftermath of nothingness that not only the I cease to exist on this earth at this time and encounter whatever comes next based on what you believe, and then kind of the fallout of what everybody else has to deal with is the consequence. Um, And I think literary authors want you to see that played out so that you can ask the question of life and worth and human value. And as a lovely thing, as Christians, we have answers to that. And I've taught these sort of things in non-Christian settings where even if you don't believe, I know you've heard that there is a hope. There are students that I know have never heard that there is a hope. They don't believe that there is anything more. Life is just meaningless and worthless. And for them to read these, it puts them in a very vulnerable, dark, and scary place. And so I'm very glad we get to do this together in the context of Christianity, where I can tell you that you absolutely have answers to those harrowing questions that prey upon you, and that you really have the support and ability to find people like me or somebody else that can answer those questions and mentor you and work with you through them. So if you find that these passages are difficult, please reach out to me or someone else, and know that no, we're not glorifying or romanticizing in any way the suicide in these books. And the hope of the author and the hope that I have in guiding you through this is that we can see life does have meaning, it does have value, and that God is the one who chooses the trajectory of your life. So there is hope.